And now we have the inaugural Drummond-Rennie lecture. The first speaker for the inaugural Drummond-Rennie lecture is Isabelle Boutron. She's professor of epidemiology at the Université de Paris and head of the methods team at ANSERM Epidemiology and Statistics Research Center, CRESS. Isabelle is also director of the Cochrane Center in France, Cochrane France, co-convener of the Bias Methods Group of the Cochrane collaboration, member of the Spirit Concert Executive Committee, and member of the Peer Review Congress Advisory Board. Her research focuses on meta-research, methodological issues of assessing interventions, transparency, reporting guidelines, development and implementation, and research synthesis, and much more. Isabelle will address bias, spin, and problems with transparency of research. Isabelle.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today and a great honor to do the Drummond-Rennie inaugural lecture that will be dedicated to bias, spin, and problems with transparency of research. During my presentations, I will mainly focus on clinical research and particularly clinical trials. I would like to start with this quote from Drummond-Rennie, who wrote in the JAMA in 2001, the whole medicine depends on the transparent reporting of clinical trials. And over time, very important initiatives were put in place, developed and implemented to reduce bias and to improve transparency of research. First, the request to systematically register clinical trials, but also reporting guidelines such as the consort statement and the spirit statement, who are currently in the process of being updated. Drummond-Rennie has been key and instrumental in the development of this initiative, and some improvement over time can be observed. This study evaluated the poor reporting over time in more than 2,000 randomized controlled trials included in Cochrane Review. And as you can see of this figure, there is some improvement, particularly for domains related to the randomizations, sequence generation, and allocation concealment. However, this improvement is much more marked for high impact factors in blue on these slides. And inadequate and poor reporting remains in a high percentage of published articles. A recent study published in PLOS Biology evaluated indicators of transparency in 2.75 million articles indexed on PubMed Central. Some indicators of transparency considerably improved over time, particularly the disclosure of conflict of interest and the disclosure of funding. However, other important indicators of transparency, such as data sharing, code sharing, and protocol registrations remains very low. Regarding the publications during the COVID-19 pandemic, a study evaluated the first 251 COVID-19 randomized controlled trials, of which 130 were published as preprint. And as you can see here, the transparency indicators were low. Only 56% of the studies were prospectively registered, 38% and 40% had a protocol available and a statistical analysis plan available, respectively. 68% reported a data sharing statement. And regarding the completeness of reporting, it was poor for the definition of the primary outcomes, the reporting of allocation concealment, the results, and the reporting was appalling for harm, with only 14% of the trials adequately describing harms. In these samples, there was some preprint and there was no difference in terms of transparency indicators and completeness of reporting between the preprint and the published publications. 78 preprints were subsequently published in a peer review journal articles with a median delay of 94 days. But when comparing the reporting between preprint and subsequent publications, there was no major improvement in transparency indicators and completeness of reporting. These results could be linked to the fact that it was during the COVID-19 pandemic and that peer reviewers, editors were overwhelmed by the flow of results that they had to evaluate, and also that a lot of peer reviewers were actually involved in the planning, conduct, and reporting of clinical research dedicated to COVID. However, these results are completely in line with the previous work that was led by Sally Hopwell and Doug Altman, which evaluated the impact of the peer review process on the completeness of reporting. 93 randomized controlled trials were evaluated, and the first submissions was compared to the published articles. Overall, the impact of the peer review process was quite low. There was a median of 11% of words deleted and 20% of words added between the submitted and published articles. And in terms of completeness of reporting, if there was some improvement for sequence generation and allocation concealment, there was no change at all for important items such as primary outcomes and reporting of the results. In addition to the published journal articles, we have access to other sources of information, particularly the results that are posted on clinical trial registries. A study compared the completeness of reporting between the results posted on the registry and the results published in a peer-reviewed journal articles. And surprisingly, the results were more completely reported, but better in the clinical trial registry, namely the clinicaltrial.gov registry, compared to the publication. And this was true for all the items, and particularly important for adverse events and serious adverse events. These results could be explained by the fact that clinicaltrial.gov requests trialists to fulfill a very standardized and detailed template that is in line with the request of the consult statement. For pharmaceutical trials, we also have access to clinical study reports, which are reports that are developed by the pharmaceutical industry to submit to the regulatory agency to obtain marketing approval. The EMA, European Medical Agency, gave access to the clinical study reports. And we identified 42 trials that were listed on the EMA website. We systematically retrieved the clinical study report, searched for results posted on trial registry and for peer review publications, and compared the reporting and harm between these different sources. All the trials were concert trials. Overall, the results show that harm reporting was more complete in clinical study reports, although not perfect compared to other sources, but also that there was marked discrepancy in harm data between sources. This is illustrated on this figure. Each line represents a trials, and each column is an item assessing harm. In red, it means that there's no data from any source. In orange, it means that we have data from only one source. In green, we had data from several sources with no discrepancy. And in yellow, there were several sources with the same data, but with inconsistency. And this raises question that when we have different sources of information for the same trials, which source should be the one that is being considered as relevant? Preprint is also an important source of information, and there is a huge increase in the communications through preprints during the COVID-19 pandemic. Preprints are living documents. They can be modified, they can be updated, and they can be subsequently published. A study evaluated 139 studies with multiple sources, meaning that they had either several preprint versions or a preprint versions and a journal articles. These studies were mainly non-randomized studies evaluating COVID-19 treatments. The results show that evidence is not stable between and within sources. In 45% of the trials, there was a change in at least one evidence component, the results or the conclusion. Some tools were developed to improve the completeness of reporting. Cobweb is an online writing aid tool that aims to provide a tailored guidance to the authors when writing their first draft of their manuscript through the tools and taking into account the study design and the intervention to be reported. For example, for cluster randomized trials evaluating surgery, the tool will pull the guidelines, will combine the guidelines from consort, the extension for cluster trials, the extension for non-pharmacologic treatment, and provide to authors the items, explanation for the items, and tailored example of adequate reporting. The tool was evaluated in a split manuscript randomized controlled trial, where the different sections to be written were randomized to be written with the tool or without a tool. And the results showed that with the tool, the completeness of reporting was improved compared with no access to the tool. The peer review process also raised some questions because of its low impact on the completeness of reporting and on the selective reporting of outcomes. One proposal was to consider a different step and to have a two-step peer review process. Indeed, too many tasks are expected from peer reviewer. They have to assess the risk of bias, the applicability of the result, the transparency, the adherence to the consort statement and to the reporting guidelines, the consistency between the manuscript and registries. And this is probably too much expectations. Further, several surveys showed that most reviewers do not consider that it's their remit to check the adherence to the reporting guidelines and the consistency between the registry and the publications. So the proposal was to have a two-step where we would involve early career researcher that would be trained online and that would use an online tool, CopPeer, to assess the completeness of reporting and consistency with registry. This study was evaluated. 120 manuscripts were assessed using the usual peer review process and also assessed by early career researcher using CopPeer. And the results show that early career researcher had a better accuracy to detect inadequate reporting, incomplete reporting. Bias in reporting is also an important issue, and particularly selective reporting of outcomes. Despite the large access to registry, which render the assessment of selective reporting outcome quite easy because we just have to compare the outcome reported in the manuscript to the outcome planned in the registry. Nevertheless, some study, and this is an example of a study that assessed about 100 randomized controlled trials of colorectal cancer treatment and showed that only half were prospectively registered and 23% had primary outcome switching, mainly in favor of statistically significant results. Finally, there is an issue related to distorted reporting and particularly spin practice. So spin can be defined by a specific reporting that could be intentional or unintentional that fails to faithfully reflect the finding and could affect the impression the results produce on readers. So for example, for randomized controlled trials with non-statistically significant results for the primary outcomes, the authors could be tempted to focus on statistically significant subgroup analysis, secondary outcomes, per protocol analysis to highlight the beneficial effect of the treatment. Or they could use linguistic spin, such as saying that the treatment, the treatment effect almost reached statistical significance. The prevalence of spin has been evaluated for various types of study, randomized controlled trials, systematic review, diagnostic test accuracy study. And recently, a methodological systematic review showed that the prevalence of spin ranged from 40% to 86% in the published literature. This is problematic because there is some evidence that spin moves from the publication to the press release and to the mass media. A study evaluated a sample of randomized controlled trials and assessed the presence of spin in abstract conclusion. When there was a spin in abstract conclusion, in dark blue on the slide, the spin, there was also very frequently spin in the press release and spin in the news items. However, when there was no spin in the abstract conclusion of the articles, there was very few spin added at the level of the press release and very few spin added by journalists in the news stories. This highlights the huge responsibility of researcher in the dissemination of inaccurate and distorted information in the mass media. Can spin impact reader interpretations? A study randomized 300 researchers to assess an abstract reported with spin or the same abstract without spin. And overall, the results that showed that when the abstract was reported with spin, readers were more likely to believe that the treatment would be beneficial for the patients. This has also been assessed for news story. 3 randomized controlled trials involving overall 900 participants, randomized patients to read a news story reported with spin or the same news story without spin. And overall, the results show that the patients were more likely to believe that the treatment would be beneficial when the news items is reported with spin. Can peer reviewer reduce spin? This was assessed by comparing the submitted manuscript to the published manuscript. And overall, peer reviewer had a very low impact. And 76% of the peer reviewers failed to identify spin in abstract conclusion. A study compared spin in preprint to the subsequent publications for the COVID-19 studies and showed that the spin was removed, but only in 7% of the peer-reviewed articles, and sometimes spin was added in 1% of the peer-reviewed articles. Some attempts were made to develop some interventions to reduce spin. Particularly, the idea was to send an email to authors when their manuscript was at the revision stage of the process of the peer review, and to indicate in a very short email some statement and some recommendations to reduce spin in abstract conclusion. This intervention was evaluated in a randomized controlled trials. We had more than 184 manuscripts that were randomized, either to receive the intervention or to the usual peer review process. Manuscripts were excluded if they were immediately rejected and so they didn't reach the revision stage. And the final analysis compared the reporting of 54 articles that were submitted to the intervention versus the control group. And overall, the results did not find an impact of this intervention. These results raise a lot of questions, and perhaps we should rethink the scholarly communications. First, if we think of the format of peer review journal articles, the format hasn't changed much over time. There has been some initiatives such as abstract that were structured abstract that were very successful initiatives. But overall, there is a lot of freedom for the authors to report their results. They can report their results in the text, in tables, in figures. And but we still have quite a lot of evidence through clinicaltrial.gov that when we request a very structured and standardized way of reporting the results, we will have more complete reporting of the results, particularly for safety. Another important issue is that we need to have access to all the source of information related to a study. We need to have information from the protocol, from the statistical analysis plan, clinical study report, peer-reviewed manuscript, but also probably the peer reviewer comments, access to the individual patient data. And currently, all these information are completely fragmented with no link between the different informations and sometimes not available. So we probably need to rethink the system to make sure that we will be in a position to synthesize the results of a trials and to resolve the issue related to discrepancy between sources. Peer review publications are very often one-off publications that are quite difficult to amend and correct. And there is also no attempt to overcome cognitive bias in results interpretations. Currently, it's mainly the authors that are going to interpret their results, but the authors have cognitive bias related to the pressure to publish, but also related to the fact that they strongly believe in their hypothesis. We could think of other systems that will rely more on collective intelligence at the stage of the interpretation of the results. Finally, related to the peer review process, we have unrealistic expectations from the peer review process, considering all the tasks that has to be done, the limited number of people involved, and the limited amount of time they have to dedicate it to the peer review process. We also currently very often have a one-size-fits-all for a peer review process, where the same process is done, whatever the manuscript. And perhaps we also need to think to have different process according to the importance of the data that are presented. That might be already done in some journals. Crowdsourcing is also important. Currently, we have some crowdsourcing peer review through post-publication peer review, for example, via PubPeer. This is an interesting and quite successful initiative, but it has some limitation. It's not really organized. It's spontaneous crowdsourcing peer review, and also it's very often anonymous. And finally, with the digital revolution, there is a lot of new tools based on artificial intelligence that are being developed, and probably these tools will impact the way we do peer review, and some already talk about AI-assisted peer review. To conclude, I would like to highlight this quote from Drummond Reddy in a paper that was published in Nature. Peer review is a human system. Everybody involved brings prejudices, misunderstanding, and gaps in knowledge. So no one should be surprised that peer review is often biased and inefficient. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Isabel. Any questions from the floor? Please come to the microphone.
Wonderful talk. Thank you so much for enlightening us on the spin in peer review. So I think I'm from the physical sciences, and in theory that shouldn't happen, but it happens. It's very prevalent there as well, and it's hugely problematic for science. So I think one of the problems is that us humans love stories, and we're drawn to them. How do we make science less human, I guess?
Thank you. I agree. I think we are trained from the beginning to make story when we report a manuscript. And just thinking about grant, when you write a grant, you need to sell your project. So we probably need to rethink the way we train people related to all these issues.
So is a fundamental problem grants, I guess?
Sorry?
Is a fundamental problem like, how we assess grants or how we give out grants?
I think it's a problem on all the different steps of the research project. Of course, yeah. When we write grants, we need to overstate what type of finding we're going to have. When we write a manuscript, we're too much into trying to tell the story and sell the results. And so there's an overall rethinking on how we train people on this issue.
Thank you very much for the enlightening talk.
Let's try to alternate between in person and Zoom. Michael?
Thank you, John. We have a question from Sarah Jackson, who's attending virtually, who wondered, Dr. Boutron, if you can speak to the use of artificial intelligence in peer review and what it can be used for.
So they are related to artificial intelligence. There are some initiatives to try to use artificial intelligence to identify incomplete reporting. Artificial intelligence is also used to assess the risk of bias of some randomized control trials. Of course, it has its issues and it needs to be evaluated, and probably it's never artificial intelligence only, it's artificial intelligence that could support peer review work.
Thank you. We're running a little over, so we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay, back to the floor.
Good morning. What are the challenges that you faced, you and your team, when analyzing these discrepancies between preprints and published articles? Because preprints are things that change a lot, like you said on your presentation. And that's the question. And congratulations for your work. It's very consistent. Yeah.
So the issue related to discrepancy when you have different sources, that's the question, is important. For example, when you're doing a systematic review and doing a meta-analysis, if you have the clinical study reports on one side, the published article on the other side, and ct.gov on the third side that provide different results, which one should you use? And so I think we definitely need to have a strategy and to assess the impact of these different discrepancies and to have a hierarchy on which source that we should privilege.
Thank you.
One more question on this
Yes,
side.
I'm Bob Della Valle from University of Colorado in Cochrane Skin. You had a graph which showed one of the realms completely red. Are these realms that you're evaluating equally important for reporting and bias, or do we have to pick and choose or prioritize them?
So here the items, so the brand that you took that was entirely red. So the items are the items that are requested by the consult statement. So the consult statements state what are all the essential information that should be reported. And so some of these items were very rarely available. This item, I think, was related to the number of events that per arm that should be reported for a safety outcome.
Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you.
I think we have to move to the next session.